Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending where you are. Welcome to the second day of the Evidence for Action Symposium. We had a brilliant day yesterday and a very exciting day ahead of us today. My name is Carlos. I'm the symposium coordinator, and I will be the technical host for this plenary session. In terms of housekeeping, I would like to remind you to please stay muted and place your questions in the chat box. There will be some time at the end of the presentations for the chair to pose your questions to the speakers. If you have any technical questions, please address them to me, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Also a reminder that this session is being recorded and it will be available in the YouTube channel of the SSRP if you want to watch it afterwards. And without further delay, I'm passing the floor to Dr. John Thompson.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Let me share my screen here to get started and see if we can see that. Yes, so welcome, everyone. As Carlos said, we're now into day 2 of Evidence for Action, the International Research Symposium. Those of you who had the good fortune of attending yesterday's parallel session A2 on locally led implementation of climate adaptation in the SDGs will have heard some very insightful presentations with this challenge and possible solutions to it. And this plenary is going to develop and extend the ideas that we explored in that session. And so today I'm delighted to say that we have 2 esteemed colleagues with us who co-convened that parallel session, Ebony Holland, who's the Nature Climate Policy Lead at the International Institute for Environment and Development, where her research focuses on the interlinkages between climate, nature, and development, including the multiple dimensions of climate and biodiversity risk. She's going to be talking about from principles to practice, connecting the dots on locally led action and research to deliver for climate, nature, and people. Our other speaker is Mizan Khan, some of you may know very well, Deputy Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. He's also the director of the Least Developed Countries University Consortium for Climate Change, and he's been a lead author on the IPCC and has been a lead negotiator on climate finance for the Bangladesh delegation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change over many years. He's going to be presenting on locally led adaptation. Can it become a vehicle for transformative adaptation? Now, just by way of giving us a little scene setting, I want to just talk about what's been happening in the last few years around the topic of locally led community-based adaptation. It's not a particularly new topic, but in the last few years, we've seen growing awareness, increasing international commitment that's particularly important to this agenda. For instance, we've seen 2019, the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Summit, the Least Development Countries group of the UNFCCC, launched the LDC 2050 vision and initiative for effective adaptation and resilience. And after reviewing effective adaptation and resilience interventions, that group committed 70% of their climate finance to the local level by 2030. So that was an important landmark to really start driving not just talk, but actual investment commitments in that direction. Then following that, we saw that the Global Commission on Adaptation, which had been set up a year or so earlier, launched its locally led action track in January of 2020. And then in 2021, at the Climate Adaptation Summit, there were 8 principles of locally led adaptation that were launched with 50 endorsements from major multilateral climate funds and a number of governments. And our colleagues who are with us here today have been quite instrumental in helping to shape those principles. You'll be hearing more about those in this discussion. Then at the the UK presidency, of course, it was assumed well over a year ago for the COP26. In that, earlier in 2021, they announced support to the 8 principles, which included getting climate finance to the local level, improving access to climate finance, and strengthening the agency to the most vulnerable countries and communities through these investments. And as you may have heard in yesterday's session, we also saw the launch, or soon to have the launch, of the Adaptation Research Alliance. This will be formally launched later this year at COP26. We heard in the session that this is a broad coalition across the adaptation research and action communities, bringing together researchers and both traditional research funders and so-called action funders. And this seeks to catalyze increased investment in collaborative, Southern-led, action-oriented research driven by local needs and priorities to help create more practical, effective adaptation and resilience solutions. Now, of course, while all that great discussion was going on, we've had this global pandemic, the COVID crisis. And that, of course, has made it clear, probably even more, highlighted the importance of engaging communities in finding sustainable and equitable solutions to these global challenges. We know that the world is already dealing with multiple interconnected crises, the climate change crisis. We've all been talking about unprecedented biodiversity loss. We've also seen rising inequalities during this period. Even before the global pandemic, these things were issues, major global issues. But now we see that the poor and vulnerable communities are being disproportionately affected by the impacts of those crises and COVID, with the added injustice that few of them have contributed to these problems directly themselves. And we see that COVID-19 is also exposed and in some cases deepened entrenched inequalities, and that threatens to undermine progress towards these multiple climate, nature, and development goals. And we know that unless recovery measures are fair and inclusive, decades of development gains could well be wiped out. Now, at the same time, I've been doing quite a lot of research on COVID-19 around food systems and local livelihoods in different contexts with partners across sub-Saharan Africa, and seeing the situation in other parts of the world. But one of the key lessons I think we've been learning over the past 18 months is that COVID-19 interventions have been most effective where local people have been connected with other local and external actors to influence policy actions and practical interventions, both vertically, looking at vertical linkages to policy actors, to technical support, humanitarian assistance, to flexible finance, and also horizontal linkages to develop and to share different sorts of solutions and learning and knowledge across communities and across sectors. So that leads to the question, what can we learn from these experiences to drive more transformative adaptation from below? It's against that backdrop that our two speakers will be outlining their ideas on the challenges and opportunities for advancing this critical agenda today. And with those thoughts, let me invite our first speaker, Ebony Holland, to give us our first keynote talk. Ebony, over to you.
Thank you so much, John. It's such a big question that you pose. Hopefully we can touch on it between Mizan and I in our keynote addresses just now. Before I get going, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to you, John, and also to Carlos, and congratulations to you and the whole team on a really fantastic symposium so far. There's been some really interesting discussions, and we're really proud to be part of both the parallel session yesterday and today's keynote address session as well. So thank you very much. As John said, my name is Ebony Holland, and I'm the Nature Climate Policy Lead at the International Institute for Environment and Development, or IIED in short. And it's my absolute pleasure to be here with you all today, and of course to share this virtual stage with Professor Mizan Khan from the International Centre for Climate Change and Development. IIED has collaborated with Salim and Mizan and the whole ICCCAD crew for many years now, and particularly we continue to work closely together on this theme of locally led adaptation. And so it's really great that Mizan and I can both talk to you about this today to kind of get some thoughts going and share some of the research that we've been doing. And I have it on good authority that Mizan will indeed deliver a very provocative keynote address. So I'm glad that I'm going first. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with IIED, we are a policy and action research organisation. We promote sustainable development to improve livelihoods and protect the environment. And for many years now, we've worked with local communities and actors to strengthen their voice in decision-making arenas that affect them, be that at the local village level or in international conventions. And we're certainly focusing a lot on that latter component this year. We work across multiple sectors, including climate change, biodiversity, forests, oceans, food systems, like what John mentioned, markets, energy, and many other areas. And we really try and bring that multidisciplinary approach to our work. And hopefully the research that I'll outline to you today demonstrates that. Just as part of the framing for my keynote, one of the things I wanted to just mention is that the one thing that's kind of really, or one of the things that's really united the IIED team this year is the 2021 super year. We've all kind of really rallied around the idea that this is a really defining moment for us all as we push for greater outcomes for climate, nature, and people. And John gave a really good overview of some of the really big developments that are happening. And of course, all of this is overlaid by the pandemic context. But the decisions taken this year really will influence the next decade of action for climate, nature, and people. And we're really keen to make sure that we live and breathe the research that we make, and we do our best to make sure that evidence moves to action, which of course is the theme of the symposium. I won't go into the details of the big events and the big moments happening this year. I think we're all quite familiar with them. There's COP26, there's COP15 on the biodiversity side, there's the G20, we've already had the G7, etc. But we're really looking for those critical moments to kind of hook research and the needs and kind of wants of the local partners that we work with, and try and find ways to hook them into these big decision-making moments. And I would just say that is why I think symposiums like this one, but also Gabeshana, the community-based adaptation conference that was held last month, Development and Climate Days that happens around the UNFCCC COP, they're a part of an important continuum of events and conferences that happen where we all get together as researchers and practitioners to share information, share experiences, and keep that pressure on for good decisions. And I know Mizan will talk more about those a little bit later as well. So in terms of my keynote address today, what I would like to do is to share some insights from two research projects that we've published quite recently. The first on climate finance, and for those of you who joined our parallel session yesterday, you'll have already had a sneak peek of that one. And the second is on nature-based interventions. I will share the key findings from those that are particularly relevant to locally led action, as this is the topic that we're discussing today. And then I really want to drive home how we're using this research to help strategically influence some of the big decisions that will be made this year. I was briefly going to touch on what we mean by locally led action. I feel like John may have already kind of touched on a little bit of this already, so I won't go into this in too much detail. But I just did want to say that there's different interpretations of what locally led action means. Most would agree that it's about local people participating in and helping to determine the climate, nature, and development outcomes in their communities. But what we find in practice is that often locally led basically means predetermined ideas or options that are presented to communities for them to kind of choose, and then things are delivered often without their engagement. We would argue that that is not locally led action, and that locally led action means local actors are part of the design and influencing these options right from the beginning, and that they're a core part of the implementation of the actions as well. So I just wanted to frame that so that I give you a sense for where I'm coming from, or where IIED is coming from when we talk about locally led action. There's a whole range of reasons why locally led action is important. I won't go into that now because I don't think we have a lot of time, but I'm very happy to touch on that a little bit later. Okay, So I'm now going to talk about two pieces of research. And I must caveat all of this by saying that they're very complex, very comprehensive pieces of research, and I won't be able to do them full justice in the time we have available. But I will draw out the key findings that relate to locally led action, and then we can talk about it further in the Q&A session afterwards if it's of interest. I am going to share my slides. It's always the first technical hiccup along the way. Yeah, perfect. Hopefully you can all see that. Okay, so the first piece of research I want to touch on is a big piece of analysis we recently did on tracking climate finance in least developed countries. There, as John outlined very well at the start, there are growing calls for the localization of international climate adaptation finance, and the least developed countries in particular are very loud on this. As John mentioned, there is an agreement or a commitment amongst least developed countries to get 70% of their climate finance to the local level by 2030, which is a really fantastic commitment to make. This report that I'm referring to here, released just last week by my colleagues, investigates how feasible it is to actually track this adaptation finance to the local level in LDCs. And we did this by investigating the reporting by bilateral and multilateral contributors to the OECD Development Assistance Committee's credit reporting system, a lot of words there. And from this analysis, we looked at what the reporting is actually showing us, where some of the gaps may be, and opportunities for strengthening that reporting going forward, so we can get a much better picture of how this climate finance is actually reaching the local level and delivering on adaptation outcomes. So, as I said, it won't be possible to go through the full report, but those of you who came to our session yesterday would have had a much more detailed overview from Claire Shakir, my colleague. But there are three findings that I wanted to pluck out for our discussion today. The first really relates to the image on the slide on the right, the big circles. And the main kind of point that I wanted to make here is that there is actually not enough climate adaptation finance reaching LDCs to meet their adaptation needs. I don't think this is particularly groundbreaking. I think people already have a sense for this, but this research really provides some figures around this. In the yellow circle, what this represents is the analysis that we did across the nationally determined contributions from LDCs, and we looked at what resourcing needs they identified in order to meet their adaptation goals. And we found that over 5 years, for LDCs to meet these adaptation needs, they would need $200 billion. So that's the yellow circle. Yet our review of actual investments reported in the DAC could only verify that US $5.9 billion of climate adaptation finance was actually invested in LDCs over a 5-year period. And that is where climate adaptation was the primary objective of that particular investment. And so there's a really substantial gap here, and this is a really big finding of the report. And our concern is that if this trend continues, it would mean that less than 3% of the LDC's estimated annual adaptation finance needs would be met between 2020 and 2030. So that's a pretty major gap in investment needed, and a key point of this particular report. The other two findings I will also quickly highlight as well, and that is that it's actually quite unclear how much of this $5.9 billion is actually reaching the local level. The research we did showed that as much as 46% of adaptation finance is intended to give agency to local actors, and up to 80% says that it targets local actors as beneficiaries. Though we found quite little evidence of local actors fully leading adaptation interventions in a sort of locally led way, and that would lead to more transformative type adaptation actions. And the third finding is one that IIED is very kind of insistent on at the moment, and there's much more attention being given to this now as well, and that's around the low levels of transparency in reporting by bilateral and multilateral organisations. We found that 45% of the adaptation finance reported on had insufficient information in it. And this is an issue because low transparency in reporting makes it very difficult for recipient countries to see what finance is going where and by whom. And this also limits the opportunity to share lessons and to build evidence and good practice, and very much that horizontal perspective or horizontal linkage that John was talking about at the beginning, that really limits that ability there too. And so we have much more detailed research on this transparency issue as well, and there's quite a lot contained in this report. So if that's an issue that's of interest to you, I'd really encourage you to read that. So that is the first piece of research I wanted to touch on in terms of locally led adaptation. And as I said, it's quite hot off the press and builds on quite a lot of research we've done in this space before. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at it, and I can share the links to this research and the second one I'm about to touch on. The second one is focused on nature. And this is another really fantastic report we released earlier this year. And it looks at the relationship between nature and development, and particularly if nature-based interventions can deliver local development outcomes. This is really a sort of analysis of other analysis. We looked at 70 different pieces of evidence across different regions, although mostly sub-Saharan Africa, so we do acknowledge there's a slight imbalance in the research there as well. But we looked at quite a lot of evidence to kind of come to the conclusions and the findings that we did. And this research was a collaboration between IIED and the Nature-Based Solutions at the University of Oxford. I would caveat all of this by saying that it's fair to say that the relationship between nature-based solutions, or nature-based interventions, I should say, and people has had a long and fairly checkered history, and much has been written about the social benefits that nature, or interventions that include nature, can deliver, but also there's kind of a growing awareness that there can be harmful outcomes as well. And so the purpose of this report was really to try and provide insights into the types of nature-based interventions that can help or hinder the achievement of development outcomes at the local level as well. So again, it's a very complex report. I think it's about 80 pages long, so I won't go into all of that here. But in terms of locally led adaptation, I think, or action, I should say, I think there's some really interesting findings that are relevant to our discussion today. So again, I've plucked those out for this discussion, but I'm happy to have a much more robust discussion about this report afterwards if that's of interest. The first finding, which you can see up there, is that that development outcomes were achieved really where local communities were involved, and that even where local communities weren't necessarily the main instigator of the nature-based intervention, they were still very often involved in decision-making, and where they were actively involved in the process, it correlated with development outcomes, which I think is quite a good source of evidence to have, because I think that really helps to show that involving local communities in activities that involve nature can lead to also co-benefits with development. And there's also a related finding to this, which is that where communities had little or no involvement in an intervention's decision-making process, the development outcomes were more likely to be negative. So there's two sides of the same coin there with that finding. The second finding I want to highlight is that reported local development outcomes from nature-based interventions are wide-ranging. And this is something I think we hear a lot about in the biodiversity and nature space, that the most frequent development outcomes were around local economic development, so jobs and outcomes, and food security, while the least are around health and energy security. And I think that there is more evidence for positive development outcomes and negative as a whole across the different projects and sources of input that we analysed. And I think this is important, and I mentioned this here because I think this reinforces what many of us already know, that we need programming that actively seeks these multiple co-benefits for climate change, nature, and people. And so where communities can be involved in the process of this, then I think that leads to some of these co-benefits being strengthened. The final point I'll make on this research before I go to my final slide and wrap up my keynote is that the third finding is that not all nature-based solutions are equal. And there are different types of interventions, and the 5 icons you see at the bottom of the slide are effectively the 5 types of nature-based interventions that we analysed. And not all of those types of interventions produced the same type of development outcomes. And so this is an important outcome, I think, because when negative development outcomes were reported, they were more commonly associated with protection or management type interventions. And this really reinforces the need to avoid cookie cutter approaches to make sure that nature-based interventions are highly contextualized and, of course, drawing on and actively involving local communities and all of their amazing knowledge. So that is a really quick tour of two very detailed pieces of research that we have. I could touch on a lot more, and I'm very happy to share additional pieces of research that kind of underpin a lot of this. But what I will now quickly do in my last couple of minutes is kind of talk to you about what we're doing with this. So we all know that research can't happen in a vacuum. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, IIED is very focused on the 2021 super year at the moment, and kind of finding these big moments that are having that, you know, where decisions will be made that will have impacts for all of us, for all of our partners, for everyone around the world for the next decade to come. And so how we can use this research to help lead to better action and better outcomes. So up here, I've got 5 examples of how we're doing it, which means we're very busy, but we're very happy to be doing it, of course. On the climate finance side of things, we are very actively engaging with the COP26 process, and in particular with the UK government COP26 team around climate finance matters, and in particular around better access to climate finance for developing countries, but also for local actors as well. An example of this is that we have been very engaged in the UK's climate and development ministerial process. We're not a formal partner or formally involved, but we're helping to provide support to climate vulnerable countries involved in that process, to do briefing notes, to hold pre-workshop sessions, so that climate vulnerable countries fully sort of understand the process, understand the things that will be discussed, and can form their own views and perspectives about what they'd like to ask at those big major meetings. And a lot of our research and research from other organisations are feeding into that process as well. Coming out of the Climate and Development Ministerial that was held in March, there was a commitment from the UK and from Fiji to set up a task force on access to climate finance, and we continue to remain engaged in that process. We held briefing sessions about a month ago on the terms of reference for that particular task force, and helped to co-develop a feedback letter to the UK government to outline ways to strengthen that particular task force, and that was signed by 23 government and CSO representatives from different climate vulnerable countries. So we're very active in this climate finance space this year, and we're really crossing fingers that there are some good outcomes that will come from this year. On the biodiversity side of things, we are also engaged in COP15, although it's possibly going to be delayed to next year, which may mean we'll have a 2022 super year as well. But what we're doing is we're looking at how we can help CBD negotiators to strengthen the outcomes in the global biodiversity framework that is being negotiated at the moment. And so we've put out a series of negotiator guides to help with that. We're just reviewing the current draft of the GBF now to see if those negotiator guides need to be updated in any way. But through this, we're really bringing in our research around nature and development and the co-benefits that can come from engaging local communities in nature-based interventions. I'm also very excited to say that we finally have our nature-based solutions case study report coming out next week. It's been the end of many, many months of collaboration with 15 different environment and development organisations, and that will be launched next week. And it's a really fantastic report because it highlights 13 nature-based solutions, activities at the local level around the world that really demonstrates how nature-based solutions, when done well, can deliver for climate, nature and people, and really seeks to debunk some of the issues around greenwashing, and that actually there's some really fantastic things that can come of nature-based solutions. That's coming out next week. And then the final piece, which I won't touch on too much because John has already touched on this, and I think Mizan will also, is around continuing to build a community of practice around the principles for locally led adaptation, and also getting very involved in that Adaptation Research Alliance. And everyone here is very welcome to join both of these. And I'm very happy to be contacted if you have any further questions on that. I'm happy to put you in touch with the right people. So John, I have gone over my allocated time. I'm very sorry for that. But I will pause there. I'm happy to take any questions now, if you like, as you mentioned, or to do so after Mizan has spoken.
I think we'll take any brief clarifications here before we move on to Mizan. So if anyone has any quick points, any questions, clarifications that can be answered quickly, we're going to have more time at the end of the session, but now is a moment for clarification. If so, please add it to the chat box. Otherwise, Ebony, I want to thank you very much for that, and elaborating a bit more on some of the themes we touched on yesterday in the parallel session. I'm not seeing any come in right now, so I will encourage people to be. I see that we've already had one comment come in, or a question for later discussion. I think that's one to pick up in more detail. So we'll do that after. So I'm going to hand over to Mizan, and I know he has provocation that he wants to set out with some conceptual thinking around transformative adaptation. So over to you, Mizan.
Yeah, thank you, John. Let me try to share the screen. So now I think you can have a look at that. Yeah.
Yes.
So the title of my presentation is, can the LLA be a vehicle for transformative adaptation, or just is it a passing fad? That is my question. And here I look at LLA as the independent variable and transformative adaptation as the dependent variable. So why it doesn't move? Why it doesn't move? I don't know.
It's not advancing for you?
Oh, yeah.
There you
okay.
go. Yes, it is.
Yeah, yes. So this is the outline. I first want to set the context of LLA, and then what really we mean by LLA and transformative adaptation. My third point will be to kind of locate what do local space or place mean, and what is their relationship with power. Then reality, what is national international governance framework or financing condition, as Ebony also has mentioned, and yesterday we had discussions on this. And can it be done? Can LLA become the vehicle? So I propose a conceptual framework. My presentation is a little text heavy because it's mostly about ideas. So as I mentioned, in development engineering, organizing themes or principles keep changing. And in climate change, you know, there are few latest accretions like resilience, transformative adaptation, LLA, decentralized finance, etc. But I personally believe that LLA will have more staying power than other passing themes, because climate change is not going to go away from our life. So we have to be grounded to the LLA. This is my personal conviction. And we all know how LLA came into being. John also has already mentioned about that. So let me go to next about my argument. Here, mostly my argument is, you all know, there is no contestation about the rationale or efficacy of LLA. So let me go to the questions that I'm raising. Can the mainstream model, which if unreformed, realize the LLA potential? A business unusual approach, I think, will be needed, and that requires questioning the current assumptions and approaches. Okay, so what actually should we mean by LLA? As I mentioned, under what conditions LLA can realize this potential? My argument is that we need to reconnect local or a space with power. So a revaluation of a space where focus to be given to physical, situating human artifacts in the natural world, as Ebony has just referred to about the solutions based on nature, and institutional, where we need to look at the relationship, human relationship with the hierarchies of political and administrative power. So along this line, I propose a 7-element conceptual framework. Okay, so we all know that LLA is regarded as a shift in adaptation paradigm. So meaning a shift in fundamental approaches and assumptions, as I mentioned. And literature shows the overwhelming practices in adaptation are driven not by local actors, but by actors far away from the space or place or local, what we call. So if we really mean a paradigm shift, then we must ask who, what, how, and when in adaptation actions. And all this is related to power structure. In LLA, I try to explain these two L's. First L should define what is local, what is its relationship with the space or place, and power, and the second is central, which is less controversial in the sense locally led. We have to understand how to lead, which actors will lead the process, what are the conditions needed for leading by the local community. So, and this inquiry, I think, can better inform the challenges in applying LLA principles that Ebony has been talking about. Next, who are the leading local actors? Are they the government functionaries or the elected local representatives or local business and CSO leaders? My argument is local government officials are transferable, like the central government officials. So local government officials only can facilitate, but they cannot be given the responsibility to lead. So the local elected representatives, community and business leaders must lead, with local government supporting the processes. And our main task, if we want to see LLA succeed, then we need to create globally the local level leaders that we need to find out and train them. So, and we all understand that LLA is wider than CBA, which subsumes the community-based adaptation. And then the legacy. Here, I have tried to bring in philosophical discussion about the focus of the temporal over spatial in historic time period. So social theory up until the 60s has emphasized on the temporal, that is the historical axis of determinants of human relationships at the expense of the spatial. I mentioned, I have a quotation from Foucault here, who wrote very extensively about knowledge, power, and space. I am not going to read that. The basic idea of this quotation is that space was neglected in favor of the temporal. So we need to kind of reevaluate and bring in a space in our discourse and discursive debate. And so about the concreteness of spatial practices, and also about philosophizing based on modern ontology and epistemology. So a renewed tradition of critical analysis of power and space began since the 1960s. And in such a evaluation, I have mentioned that we need to focus on both physical and institutional. You all are familiar with, I think, one of the best sellers in the world is Shoemaker's Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. Okay, it's an kind of attempt to reframe our development projects, aligning a smaller scale local initiatives with the space and power. Okay, now my title of this slide is Getting Back Local to Reshape the Global. Okay, so local places change because are changed for the last 3 decades, particularly because of modernization and globalization across the world, particularly in developing countries also. And as a result, some scholars refer to those terminologies like eraser, place, then non-places, placelessness, etc. Actually, society, people's identity and places have become fluid. But Hollings, I like this article and the EU project SUS+, which I have gone through quite extensively, and I like those ideas. And the authors of this program, article based on this program, EU SUS+ program, argue, and I fully agree, that places is more relevant than ever, even if we have globalization, erasure of those kind of special localities. It's not just space is not just a blank canvas, not just a geographical entity with varied resources, but it embodies culture, values, ethos, and relations. Human beings are embedded in some localities, in some spaces, and not just for food and production, but with all their relations and connectivity. So we can look at local or place just as an administrative area or unit, like our local governments. As in Britain, you also have cantons or counties. In America, they have counties. But relationally oriented scholars point to not just the administrative area, but also to actors, relations, processes, networks. That is, the focus more on connectivity. That is stressed beyond the administrative boundaries. Okay, so we need to kind of challenge the view that local, view of local as the product of global. And we need to reestablish the fact that a local construction of the global, only then I think locally led adaptation can succeed. So national states, you know, as an omnipotent institution, omnipowerful institution is challenged both by below and above, from business sector, multinational corporations, all those multilateral entities, and from below because of the subsidiarity principle. And so we need to promote from below the social entrepreneurship, if we want to succeed, LLA, not just American individual-based, profit-seeking ventures, but social entrepreneurship is a little different than pure private firms. Okay, and then what is transformative adaptation? And there is reference of transformation or transformative adaptation in the SDG preambles or in the GCF mandate. GCF, in fact, I think among the first multilateral agencies that mentions about transformative adaptation. Okay, so I have a definition of my own here. I have gone through some literature, but this is my formulation, that transformative adaptation as the end result of enhanced resilience and adaptive capacity on a sustainable basis against special and socioeconomic vulnerabilities from current and future climate impacts. Because we know climate impacts vary regionally, locally, as well as across a wider spectrum of the income classes based on the locations. So transformative adaptation is frequently contrasted with incremental adaptation. Incremental adaptation, certainly we need to do it, but it is within the given existing power structure without changing the system or questioning the system. But incremental adaptation, I argue, will not add much to transformative adaptation. We need to go business unusual way if we, and here I mentioned some characteristics of transformative adaptation, which looks at systemic changes as a whole, combining, integrating human ecological systems. Okay, and then with focus on sustainability, local sustainability, sustainability of environmental resources, which kind of includes both tangible and intangible resources. Then grounding human artifacts on spaces, places in the natural world. I was a MacArthur Fellow in ecological economics in the mid-90s, but I didn't bring in that much because ecological economics is still not mainstream. But we need to question neoclassical economics. And you know, for the last decade or 15, 20 years, critics of neoclassical economics are awarded Nobel Prize in economics, like Amartya Sen, Elinor Ostrom, Joseph Stiglitz, and Nordhausen, all those authors. So we, neoclassical economics in no way can remain the mainstream model if we want to have some changes in the world, not just in LLA, but along the poverty issues also. So From that perspective, I bring in the known concept and discipline of political ecology, which is not still very much in vogue, which is not mainstream. So a political ecology is a powerful discourse combining elements of ecology and political economy. And this seeks to ground centralist hierarchies to place on people. Okay, as climate change impacts on natural resources, habitats, human artifacts, which are local, so political economy of adaptation is also local, but connected at other scales, including global, because adaptation originates from global causes. So even if we are grounded to local, we have to act locally, but we have to link that local with global sphere. There is a hierarchy, structural antipathy to central regulation of ecological resources, because we know that now ecosystem-based management or adaptation are currently getting into our vocabulary by the CBD, by the Climate Convention or IUCN, which grounds economic activities to fit within a hierarchy of ecosystem functioning. So, and this is not just technical, but transformative of the industrial or centralist corporatized frame. And this will contribute to turn on its head the existing approach of global-local to local-global, as I mentioned, thus reconstructing what has been deconstructed during the 20th century. Human person as members embedded in local or spaces. It is the antonym of castle in the forest. You all know that classical economics had some grounding with natural resources because prices was fixed based on the cost of materials as well as cost of labor. But then neoclassical economics started defining price based on purely subjective value of consumers or based on utilities. And so there is a total divorce between economics and nature under neoclassical economics. So market mechanisms will remain and must remain, but under the control of local communities and leaders and localities. So there is a mismatch. Already about financing we have discussed about. There is a mismatch between what should be and what is there. This GCS flagship report, ADAPT, now has strongly argued for decentralized funding, default funding. Okay, and LDCs, all you know, under Vision 2020, their commitment of 70% of climate finance to go down to the local level. And so this is now more important that local communities as the frontline face ADAPT quadruple distresses now. COVID-19, and we know the sufferings we have been witnessing for the last 18 months, and then environment and climate twin crisis, which reinforce each other, and poverty. So this quadruple distress, I find that we have to live with and address how to tackle. But under the grand bargain of 2016, for example, on humanitarian assistance, despite the target being fixed of 25% of finance, humanitarian finance going to the local level, we have only less than 5%. In fact, I saw IIED report, the latest report, I think, which I have mentioned has some data. They mentioned about 2.5% of humanitarian assistance going to local level. But I have cited here the ODI data. And we know less than 10% targeted climate finance to the local level. Reality is still lower. And 80-20, this ratio relates to two facts. One is ratio versus mitigation and adaptation, as well as loan versus grant. These two numbers exactly. Even for the LDCs, we have more than 2/3 of adaptation finance is loan. So we are having a new climate debt trap, what we call. And 20% of bilateral adaptation goes to the LDCs, and increasingly ODA is used as adaptation finance. But the interesting fact is overall ODA is going down. And as a long-time negotiator, we always argue that climate finance is different from ODA because it's new and additional, agreed by the industrial countries under Article 4.3. But compliance is not there. You all know about $100 billion, so I don't want to go in details. But I fully agree that adaptation and development cannot be differentiated. Fine. But if part of ODA goes to addressing climate change, fine, because there is the difference between the two is fuzzy. But if increasing amount of climate ODA is used as climate finance, at least ODA should go up. Okay, I'm not mentioning about 0.7% and all those, but this is very tragic that ODA climate finance goes up, but ODA overall go down. So this is a double loss for particularly vulnerable countries and LDCs. And here I have mentioned about the latest IIED report data. So you all know, very low level of donor transparency. This is another also mentioned in IIED report. And I have a publication as a co-author, Nature Climate Change, I think about 3 months ago, led by Professor Timmons Roberts. There we have dealt with this, how this transparency kind of is not there in climate accounting, climate finance accounting. And then very few of the 50 agencies endorsing LLA, very few agencies, for example, humanitarian organizations, some INGOs also have endorsed. But I have mentioned about the agencies, few agencies, that FCDO, we are very happy that FCDO has endorsed certainly, and we look up to UK as the leader in climate diplomacy and looking forward to COP26, where we can expect to have some very positive outcome. And Adaptation Fund, GEF, CIF, which is under World Bank, promoting mainly private initiated adaptation actions, and UNDCF and UNDP. These are the agencies, bilateral and multilateral, which have so far endorsed LLA principles, but we expect that they should do more. And here, I have tried to look at the budget of select developing countries, and including some industrial country, Netherlands is here. Sweden, in fact, I see a country which is most localized as a country. Sweden is the most localized in the world to me, but that data is a little fuzzy, about 60% about provinces or cantons, so I couldn't figure it out, but I will do in my research in future. But here, if we want to focus on local development, sustainable development, social dimension, face disease and all those, then we need to kind of increase the budget of the local governments, because in Dhaka city, for example, also you have local governments. It's the municipality, the city corporation is a local government. So look at the figure, only less than 7% of the money goes to the local governments, including municipal corporations and the rural areas where we have up to union councils, lowest strata of our local government. But India and some Philippines also not very good, but South Africa is better in that sense. And Netherlands has got about almost more than 13% of their budget going to the local level. And the remaining 3 elements I have: capacity building, action research, and MEL, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We all agree that earlier supply-driven capacity building, technical assistance-based capacity building didn't kind of contribute so much to capacity building in the recipient countries. And there are lots of literature, including our publications, including a book and some other articles. Now focus is given to the demand-driven capacity building. Okay, and this, we need to focus on capacity building directed to local leadership. Okay, and that has to be done in Bangla language, in local language. Okay, and it cannot be done by foreign consultants. And capacity building to focus on understanding of local impacts, designing of fundable projects and implementation, as well as fiduciary management. This is extremely important because I personally don't expect that industrial countries will support us. And if we do not have kind of a good management framework, financial management framework, quite transparent and accountable, then we shouldn't expect money. I very loudly argue that money will not flow to the most vulnerable countries, but it will flow to the countries which merit, where governance system is better, transparent, and accountable. So experience in adaptation interventions is relatively low. So we have to have a learning by doing approach, which is one vital principle of LLA. And this is where action research is extremely important. That integrates local or indigenous and scientific knowledge and methods. So ARA we know is a new platform where ICCCAD also now is a member. And finally, monitoring and evaluation is extremely important, but big data will not do. And there are, I know, millions of projects with millions of dollars for generating big data, but that will not do any service to this locally led adaptation. We need to disaggregate national data because, for example, GDP doesn't have any meaning for the poor and the vulnerable because it's an average. A rickshaw puller's kind of income is added to a billionaire's income, so it doesn't have any meaning. That is why we need data which is class differentiated, income group differentiated, which is especially differentiated because some areas are more vulnerable than others. So we really need to kind of generate subnational level and local level data and indicators for effective monitoring evaluation. And that is the reason I argue that our national adaptation plan should be an aggregation of the local level adaptation plans. Because in Bangladesh, a very small country, territorially, we are big in population, but territorially also we have many different agroecological zones where climate impacts are different and very widely. So
Mizan, could I ask you to begin wrapping up? We're going to leave some time for Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, just in 1 minute. So in these three elements, universities must have a leading role as the central hub. And this is my conceptual framework. Just it's the infographic is not perfect. Here we have 7 elements. Political, administrative, ecological, social, cultural, financial, economic, capacity building, action research, and finally monitoring and evaluation. So this is just my preliminary thought I wanted to share. I have to seriously work further on it. Thank you very much. I've taken a little more time. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a whirlwind of information and ideas. Thank you. And a real provocation. So I appreciate that very much. You could stop sharing your screen now.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
We have received a couple of questions in the chat box. Now's the time to ask a question to one or both of our keynote speakers. We've had a couple come in already. Let me start with those. The first to Ebony. What are your recommendations for increasing the likelihood that nature-based interventions lead to positive incomes? I think this is outcomes for both people and nature.
Great question. And in fact, in the report on Nature for Development, we do touch on some of these as recommendations, and we also have some recommendations in our nature-based solutions report coming out next week. I think there's a couple of points. I'm just trying to think how I can succinctly reply to this without having another 15-minute keynote address. I think there's a couple of really fundamental things that need to happen. The first is that development organisations really need to pay greater attention to the opportunities that nature-based interventions offer, both for development outcomes, but also pay attention to the risks that ongoing biodiversity loss also has for achieving those development outcomes. And as you mentioned at the start, John, ongoing biodiversity loss really does undermine the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think development organisations having that much more at the front and centre of their design and their work would help here. I think that ensuring that investments in nature really are designed and implemented with full and active local participation is important. And I take your point, Joe, that UN and national governments recognise this, but I think what we're seeing and what the research keeps telling us is that it's not actually really happening. And so I think really continuing to drive that message that we need full and active participation from local actors is really important to this, is still an ongoing need. There's more I could mention. I think another thing is to look at opportunities to scale up interventions that have worked well, notion that they still need to be contextualised in the places that they are, and that to ensure that we have long-term funding for these interventions, we need to really shift, this goes for climate as well, shift away from these sort of short-term projectised approaches to investing in nature and climate and shift to much more longer-term funding. So that's a couple of things I would just say in relation to that question. I hope that helps.
Thank you. A second question's come in. It's really a comment as much as a question. From complex systems thinking, a complex systems thinking perspective of interlinkages and interdependencies, how sure are we that local nature-based, I guess, solutions will have the desired sustainable emergent outcomes? It's part of a bigger complex system. I think that's directed to both of you. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, if I may come in.
Please.
Yeah. Yeah, I am familiar with this complex systems theory, world dependency theory, and all those. In fact, we have forwarded an article in the Political Geography about these, about climate finance distribution, unequal distribution. Yes, I understand these dynamics. Now, the problem is that, as I mentioned in my presentation, that if really we want to have real nature-based solutions, then, and also LLA and nature-based solutions are integrated. We have to think it together, because when we talk of local level adaptation, then local means some space, and that embodies both, for example, resources, people, and the interactions. And those interactions spread far beyond that geographical regions. So from that perspective, we need to think, and there are also some initiatives, for example, fair trade and all those globally. So the traditional system that we have witnessed for the last 50, 60, 70 years, this dependency theory and all those. Now things are changing a little, because those dependency theory actually is still no more we can tell are valid, because now developing countries and the producers in the developing countries also are becoming more assertive. That is why things are changing gradually. But if we kind of try to have some facilitative process, then the transformation will happen in a quicker space than. But there will be barriers, oppositions, I know, because this global hierarchy of power. Power is not shared, it has to be extracted. It has to be kind of realized by those who need to change. But those already who hold power will not willingly share. So thank you, this is my take.
Thank you, Mizan. Ebony, do you want to add to that?
I do, but I don't have much to add because that was such a great response. I think the only thing I would say in relation to this sort of comment or question is that for nature-based solutions to work, they need to be high quality and they need to be done well. And there are examples of where this hasn't been the case, for example, monoculture type tree planting and such. And so there are risks that come with it. And I think appreciating what those risks are and kind of moving away from them is really important. But I think nature-based solutions and nature-based interventions can absolutely drive sustainable development. I would also say, and just very much echoing what Mizan said, is that nature-based solutions need to sit within a broader systemic shift to addressing the pressures of unsustainable production and consumption. And so they're not necessarily going to be a silver bullet in themselves, but they're a great option that sits within a broader matrix of things that need to happen. And again, I'll come back to the point that we need long-term financing to really see these emergent sustainable development outcomes happen. And I just really wanted to pick up on something that Mizan said in his keynote, which was around this kind of shifting the kind of narrative that the global kind of influence the local, and kind of turning that around and allowing the local to construct the global. And that's such a powerful statement. And I think nature-based solutions can offer that, and locally led adaptation and action generally can. But I think through these types of locally led initiatives, we can start to see these systemic changes take place right up through to the global level.
Thank you. Let's see, are there other questions coming in at this point? Not that I'm seeing. That now's an opportunity. We have a few more minutes left. Let me, while we're waiting for other points to come in, let me take you back to the 8 principles idea that we were talking about at the start of locally led adaptation. And just to highlight these for people, because we didn't really foreground those, we made reference to them. Let me see if I can just share my screen here. So you can see these. Is that coming up?
Yes.
Great. And I don't know if either of you want to make reference to this. These ideas have been embraced, as I mentioned in my opening talk, and we've made reference to these over the past few days. But now, of course, and the ideas that you've been elaborating here on locally led adaptation, and even more kind of challenging transformative adaptation, we are facing a time of resource scarcity, as you were both describing. So we're needing to make the most of the least. Is there a case that can be made that locally led adaptation can, and not to say do things on the cheap, but can be more efficient and more effective while also being more equitable? Is there a case to be made around that to say, look, yes, we do need more climate financing, as Mizan was describing, seeing decline in ODA, but using ODA more effectively, using climate finance more effectively, if that channeling of the majority of climate finance resources goes towards backing these principles, is that a way ahead? Can a case be made? Is a case being made? And are funders, governments taking that seriously?
I may come in?
Please.
Yeah. Yes, I fully agree that these 8 principles are excellent, you know. But I became a little provocative only because, you know, these sacrosanct principles, we have many of these principles and international regimes, you know, which sounds very good, but reality is kind of, we are nowhere close to reality. This is, I'm a little frustrated. So these principles, in order to apply, for example, certainly we can do certain things. This is the reason yesterday I asked the question to the World Bank, Margaret, that Kenya is succeeding in kind of reaching out to local communities with good money, good amount of money and the mechanisms. So why not what other developing countries can do? In most of the developing countries still are centralized, you know. This is and the bureaucrats, government officials, not even the politicians, not even the elected representatives dominate the whole governance process. Okay, this is where the problem. That is why, for example, I have a concrete suggestion. If these LDC governments have this pledge of 70% going down to local level of climate finance. Now, against this, the development partners, because I agree that increasingly development partners are having less and less voice to influence the developing countries because their income level is going up and the dependency on foreign aid is going down. That is one. But whatever is there, development partners don't just give for a financial support, but they also can be the leader in norm promotion, norm building, which in many low-income countries still we lack. So developed countries can have a pledge, for example, that this much is significant share of climate finance must go to the local level to match the LDC government's pledge. But this pledge is not enough. We need to have kind of a strict mechanism to follow through. This is where it's lacking. And in international diplomacy, this is a serious problem because we don't have the sanctioning powers. You look at the mitigation ambition. We cannot do anything if countries, a bottom-up approach we have under Paris Agreement. But for such gentlemen's agreement, we need to be gentlemen in terms of countries. But not all countries are gentlemen. Gentlemen's agreement happens when all parties are gentlemen. But countries, if not, look at the experience of Canada or Russia or Japan. Just in 2010, 2011, despite being party to Kyoto Protocol, they have walked out of the Kyoto Protocol. Walked out simply because they cannot comply with. And nothing we could do. The global community could do nothing. That is why I argue that the civil society activism, we need to kind of create a strong local level leaders. That is where more funds should go. First, funding should go to creating local level leaders, not the government functionaries, but local level leaders. Still, our politics is not still very good because local representatives also are not very honest because they are not still open and transparent. That is why we really need a balance, check and balance system, transparency mechanism and accountability mechanism, which should flow both up and down. This is my take. Otherwise,
thank you. That's principle 7 in the list there. Yes, Ebony, do you want to add to that?
I will just super quickly. Thanks, John. I think, your question about if sort of locally led action can sort of lead to outcomes on the cheap, I think is a good one. And I think one of the benefits of having locally led action is that local actors bring sort of unique traditional, cultural, indigenous and generational knowledge systems that may not naturally come down from that global level. And so they're bringing a different dimension to the actions that would not be there, which I think in turn kind of fosters a greater sense of ownership at the local level over these actions, which can lead to kind of stronger outcomes in the long term. I do think that locally led action can have good economic benefits at the local level, which kind of go beyond the kind of initial target of the particular intervention, which is a good thing. And of course, it can deliver development outcomes that we talked about before. So I kind of hesitate to say that it's a kind of methodology that can be used to deliver cheap outcomes, but I think there are ways that it can help. One of the points I wanted to make, just picking up on what Mizan was saying, was that he's absolutely right. So there's actually quite good commitment to the principles at the moment. There's about 50, I think there's more than 50 organisations from both government and non-government organisations signing up to this, including climate finance providers. And that is fantastic because it signals that there's interest and kind of a willingness to shift in the right direction. But actually the commitments aren't enough. We really need to see greater action, greater tangible case studies of where implementation towards locally led action is happening. And that we're really working with the kind of other people involved in the principles at the moment to build this community of practice. And we're really looking to transition this into a much more of a kind of implementation focus now, rather than just to kind of sign up and get involved. And could not agree more with Mizan's kind of gentleman's agreement analogy, in that we do need countries to commit to this, but we also need them to follow through with that commitment, agree to a certain amount that they will deliver at the local level, address these really critical issues that Mizan mentioned around governance and finding the right mechanism to deliver that money, but also radically transform the way that we transparently report on this finance, particularly in the climate space. And so I think that combination of things is kind of very much grounded in these principles, and I think they can absolutely help deliver this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to both of you. I just want to, before we close this session, I want to direct people's attention to the parallel sessions that will follow after a short break. We have three fantastic sessions lined up, one dealing with some of the legal, financial, and institutional aspects. Is that coming through? Yep, right there. Looking at combining climate adaptation, sustainable development. That's parallel session A3. We have another dealing with indigenous peoples, climate change adaptation, protected areas from lessons from South Africa. And a third, that's B3. And then C3 looks at towards green recovery and sustainable transitions in India. So talking about place-based issues as well as key thematic topics that will be critical to the discussions that we have in this super year as Ebony described it in 2021. So we invite you to choose one of the three. It's a shame we can't attend them all, I know. But I'd just like to close by thanking our two speakers, Mizan Khan and Ebony Holland, for their brilliant contributions both yesterday and today, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all. Can we give them all a round of applause, please, at least virtually? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, John, and the audience for bearing with us.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.